Don't touch him. People like that bring trouble. The words cut through the hum of fluorescent lights as the man staggered beside pump number 3, his boots scraping against the concrete like they no longer remembered how to walk straight. Aaliyah Carter looked up from the register, her fingers still wrapped around a crumpled $5 bill and 3 singles, the last $8 she had to her name. And for a second, everything else in the gas station faded into a dull, distant blur. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his leather vest worn and heavy with patches she didn't recognize but felt she was supposed to, the kind of symbols people whispered about and avoided. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, one woman quietly guiding her child toward the door, another man muttering under his breath as he reached for his keys, already halfway out. No one stepped forward. No one asked if he was okay. The automatic doors hissed open and closed as if the building itself was breathing him out. Aaliyah swallowed, her throat tight, her eyes catching the way his hand pressed briefly against the side of the pump, steadying himself, not dangerous, not threatening, just tired, like something had worn him down from the inside out. He'll be fine, her manager said flatly from the back, not even looking up from his clipboard. Guys like that always are. But Aaliyah didn't move back to the register. She couldn't. Something about the stillness in his shoulders, the way the world seemed to step away from him, hit too close to something she didn't have words for. She thought of her mom sitting in that dim apartment, coughing through the night because they couldn't afford another prescription refill this week, of the quiet way people stopped noticing when you didn't have money, like you slowly disappeared in plain sight. Her grip tightened around the bills. $8. Gas to get home. Maybe a cheap dinner. Maybe nothing at all tomorrow. Her heart pounded once, hard, like a door slamming shut or opening. The man shifted again, his breath visible in the cool night air as he leaned slightly forward, eyes half-focused, scanning nothing. Aaliyah stepped out from behind the counter before she could second-guess it. The bell above the door chimed softly as she pushed it open, the cool air brushing against her skin, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and rain-soaked pavement. Every step toward him felt louder than it should, like the whole world was listening. Someone behind her whispered, "She's crazy," but she didn't stop. Up close, she could see the lines in his face, not anger, not threat, just exhaustion, etched deep. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice steady even though her chest felt tight. He blinked, slow, like it took effort just to focus on her. Aaliyah glanced down at the money in her hand, then back up at him, and without giving herself time to hesitate, she pressed the bills gently into his palm. "You look like you could use this more than I do." For a moment, neither of them moved. The world held its breath. Then somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the sky, and the first drop of rain tapped softly against the concrete. The rain did not fall all at once. It came slowly, like the sky was thinking about it first, each drop tapping against the pavement in uneven rhythm as Aaliyah pulled her hand back and watched the crumpled bills settle into his palm, his fingers closing around them with a stiffness that suggested more than just fatigue, something older, heavier, something carried for too long. Up close, she noticed the faint tremor in his hand, the way his breathing steadied just slightly, as if the simple act of being seen had shifted something inside him, even if only by an inch. He looked down at the money, then back at her, his eyes clearer now, not sharp, not threatening, just searching, like he was trying to understand why. "You should keep it," he said after a moment, his voice low, rough, but controlled, not demanding, not dismissive, just uncertain, like the idea of someone giving without expecting something in return did not fit into the world he knew. Aaliyah shook her head gently, a small movement, but firm. "I will be okay," she said, even though the words pressed against the truth in her chest, even though she could already feel the quiet consequences waiting for her when the night ended and the bills came due. Another drop of rain landed on her sleeve, then another, until the air filled with that soft, steady sound, the kind that wrapped around a moment and held it still. Behind her, the glass door slid open again, and her manager's voice cut through. The calm, sharper this time. "Aaliyah, what are you doing out there?" She did not turn right away. The man in front of her shifted his weight, standing a little straighter now, as if the ground beneath him had become more stable. He glanced toward the building, then back at her, and something in his expression changed, not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet acknowledgement, like a note struck too low for anyone else to hear. "What is your name?" he asked. "Aaliyah," she answered. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he was placing it somewhere important. "Thank you, Aaliyah." There was no performance in it, no exaggeration, just truth, simple and unpolished. The rain picked up, tapping faster now against the metal canopy above them, and Aaliyah finally stepped back, wrapping her arms lightly around herself as the chill settled in. "You should get somewhere dry," she said softly. He gave a small nod, then turned, moving toward the far edge of the lot where a motorcycle stood waiting, its chrome catching what little light filtered through the storm, quiet but present, like it had been there all along. She watched him for a second longer, then turned back toward the station, the door sliding open with a familiar hiss as warmth rushed over her again. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier, like the room had been holding something back. Her manager stood behind the counter now, arms crossed, his expression tight, not confused, not curious, just irritated. "We are not a charity," he said, each word measured, controlled. Aaliyah wiped a few drops of rain from her sleeve, her movements calm even as her heart beat faster. "He needed help," she replied, her voice steady, not defensive, just honest. A man near the coffee machine let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You just gave away your last few dollars to some biker you do not even know," he muttered, not unkind, but not understanding either. Aaliyah did not respond to him. Her eyes stayed on her manager. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator units and the soft tapping of rain against the windows. Then her manager exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if she had confirmed something he already believed. "Finish your shift," he said finally, turning away, but there was something in his tone that had shifted, something colder, something already decided. Aaliyah nodded once, moving back behind the counter, her fingers brushing the empty space where her money had been, the absence of it more real now, more immediate. Outside, the motorcycle engine started, low and steady, then faded into the distance, leaving behind only the rain and the quiet, and something else she could not quite name, something that lingered in the space between loss and peace, like a choice that had already changed more than she could see. The rest of the shift moved slower than usual, each minute stretching just enough for Aaliyah to feel the weight of what she had done settle deeper into her chest, not as regret, but as consequence, quiet and undeniable. The rain outside turned steady, forming thin rivers along the edges of the pavement, reflecting the flickering gas station lights in long, wavering lines that looked almost like something breathing. Inside, the air stayed warm but tense, the earlier moment still hanging between the shelves and counters like something unfinished. Aaliyah kept her movements precise, scanning items, handing back change, offering small polite nods, but her mind kept drifting, not to the man himself, but to the look in his eyes when he had said her name, the way it had sounded like it mattered. Near midnight, the crowd thinned until the station was nearly empty, just the hum of machines and the occasional car passing on the road beyond. Her manager stepped out again, slower this time, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You have been distracted all night," he said, not angry, just firm, like he was confirming a decision he had already made. Aaliyah met his gaze, calm but steady. "I am doing my job," she replied. He exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the register, then back at her. "You made a choice out there," he said. "That is not what we pay you for." The words landed flat, but heavy. Aaliyah did not argue. She simply nodded once, understanding more from what he did not say than what he did. The clock above the cooler ticked forward, each second sounding louder in the quiet. When her shift finally ended, the rain had softened to a light drizzle, the kind that clung to the air more than it fell. She stepped outside, pulling her jacket tighter. Around her, the night air cool against her skin as she walked toward the bus stop at the edge of the lot. The streetlights cast a soft yellow glow, reflecting off the wet pavement in long, quiet streaks. Her footsteps echoed faintly, steady, unhurried. In her pocket, there was nothing now, no folded bills, no loose change, just empty fabric brushing against her fingers. She noticed it, of course, but it did not make her stop. The bus arrived 10 minutes later with a low hiss of brakes, its interior lights warm but dim, only a few passengers scattered across the seats. Aaliyah climbed on, offering a small nod to the driver, who barely looked up, then took a seat near the middle, resting her hands in her lap as the bus pulled away. The ride was quiet, the rhythmic hum of the engine blending with the soft tapping of water against the windows. She watched the city pass by in blurred reflections, storefronts closing, street corners emptying, the world settling into that late-night stillness where everything felt more honest somehow. By the time she reached her stop, the drizzle had nearly stopped. She stepped down onto the curb and walked the last block home. A small apartment building with chipped paint and dim hallway lights that flickered just enough to remind you they were still working. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old carpet and something cooking from a nearby unit. She unlocked the door quietly and stepped in, her movements soft out of habit. In the corner of the living room, her mother slept on the worn couch, a thin blanket pulled up to her shoulders, her breathing shallow but steady. Aaliyah paused for a moment, watching her, the familiar mix of concern and determination settling into place. She moved closer, adjusting the blanket gently, making sure it covered her properly, her fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary. On the small table beside the couch, a prescription bottle sat nearly empty, the label catching the dim light. Aaliyah looked at it, then away, her jaw tightening slightly before relaxing again. She stepped back, kicking off her shoes quietly, and sitting on the edge of the chair by the window. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break, a faint line of moonlight slipping through, reflecting softly against the glass. She leaned back, exhaling slowly, her body finally catching up to the long day, the long choice. There was no applause, no recognition, no immediate change, just the quiet aftermath of doing something that felt right in a world that rarely paused to notice. And yet, as she sat there, listening to the soft rhythm of her mother's breathing and the distant hum of the city, there was something steady inside her, something that had not been there before, not louder, not brighter, just stronger, like a small light that did not need to be seen to exist. Morning came softly, not with brightness, but with a pale gray light that filtered through the thin curtains, settling gently across the worn furniture and the quiet room, as if the day itself was unsure how to begin. Aaliyah woke before the alarm, her eyes opening slowly, her body still heavy from the night before, but her mind already awake, already moving through the list of things that had not changed. The empty space in her pocket, the nearly empty prescription bottle, the shift that would not be waiting for her the same way again. She sat up carefully, her feet touching the cool floor, the faint creak of the boards the only sound in the room besides her mother's steady breathing. For a moment, she stayed still, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of reality come into focus without rushing it. Then she stood, moving through her routine with quiet precision, washing her face in the small bathroom, tying her hair back, choosing the same uniform she had worn the night before, even though something told her it would not matter the same way today. In the kitchen, she poured a small glass of water and placed it gently beside her mother, adjusting the blanket again as the older woman stirred slightly but did not wake. "I will be back soon," Aaliyah whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, her voice soft but steady. Unspoken, something waiting. The bus arrived on time, the doors opening with the same low hiss, the driver giving her a brief glance that lingered just a second longer than usual, as if recognizing her from the night before, or perhaps just sensing something different. She took her seat again, watching the city come to life slowly, storefronts opening, lights flickering on, people stepping into their routines without thinking twice. Everything looked the same, but it did not feel the same. When she stepped off near the gas station, she noticed it immediately, not because it was loud, but because it was still. The parking lot, usually scattered with a few early customers, sat unusually empty, the air holding a quiet that felt deliberate. The station itself looked unchanged, the same flickering sign, the same rows of pumps, but something beneath it had shifted, like the moment before a storm returns. Aaliyah slowed her steps slightly, her eyes scanning the space without fully knowing what she was looking for. She reached the door, pushing it open, the familiar chime echoing inside. But instead of the usual morning rush or even a casual greeting, her manager was already there, standing behind the counter, waiting. His expression was not angry, not surprised, just firm, final. "We need to talk," he said, his voice even, controlled, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Aaliyah stepped inside, letting the door close behind her, the sound of it sealing the moment in place. She nodded once, calm, her hands resting loosely at her sides. "I figured," she replied quietly. He gestured toward the counter, not inviting, not hostile, just procedural. "What you did last night," he began, pausing briefly as if choosing his words carefully. "That is not how we operate here." Aaliyah listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her breathing even. Around them, the store remained empty, the shelves untouched, the coffee machines silent, the world outside continuing as if this small, quiet moment did not exist. "You gave away money while on shift," he continued. "You stepped outside your role. That creates problems." The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. Aaliyah nodded again, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "He needed help," she said, her voice just as calm as before, not defensive, not apologetic, just true. Her manager held her gaze for a second, then looked away, exhaling softly. "That may be," he said, "but it is not our responsibility." The sentence hung in the air, heavier than anything else he had said. Aaliyah felt it settle, felt the finality in it, the quiet line being drawn. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, grounded, present, her choice already made long before this moment arrived. Outside, a faint sound began to build in the distance, low, almost indistinguishable at first, like a vibration carried through the ground rather than the air, something approaching, something not yet seen, but impossible to ignore once it was noticed. Aaliyah's eyes shifted slightly toward the door, just for a second, as the sound grew a little stronger, a little closer, while inside, the silence between her and her manager deepened, stretching into something that felt like the edge of a turning point. The sound grew louder, no longer something imagined or distant, but a deep, rolling vibration that seemed to move through the pavement and into the walls of the station, low and steady like a storm that did not belong to the sky. Aaliyah felt it before she fully heard it, a subtle tremor under her feet, her body registering it instinctively even as her manager continued speaking, his voice now fading into the background of something much larger approaching. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes shifting toward the front windows, his expression tightening just slightly, confusion replacing certainty. Outside, the first motorcycle came into view, then another, their engines humming in a synchronized rhythm that filled the air without rushing it, controlled, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Aaliyah turned slowly, her gaze drawn to the glass as the line of bikes stretched across the entrance, one after another pulling in with precision, their presence filling the empty lot that had felt so quiet just moments before. The chrome caught the gray morning light, reflecting it in sharp flashes, while the riders remained still, seated, composed, not chaotic, not aggressive, just there, like they had arrived with purpose. Inside, the silence shifted, no longer empty but charged, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel more noticeable. A customer who had just entered froze near the door, his hand still on the handle, eyes wide as he took in the scene outside. "What is that?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Aaliyah did not answer. Her attention stayed fixed on the line of motorcycles as they continued to arrive, the number growing, 10, 20, more than she could count without losing track, until the entire front of the station was filled with them, a quiet wall of presence that turned the ordinary morning into something else entirely. Her manager stepped closer to the counter, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by uncertainty. "Do you know them?" he asked, his voice lower now, cautious. Aaliyah shook her head slowly, though something in her chest had already begun to shift, a quiet recognition forming without a clear reason. Outside, the engines began to settle, one by one, the sound fading not into silence, but into a low hum that lingered in the air like an echo. Then, as if guided by an unspoken signal, the riders dismounted almost at the same time, their movements calm, coordinated, each one stepping onto the pavement with a presence that was steady rather than forceful. The doors of the station reflected them as they approached, their figures growing larger, clearer, until one of them stepped forward ahead of the others. Aaliyah's breath caught slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. It was him, the same man from the night before, now standing upright, his posture firm, his presence completely different from the quiet exhaustion she had seen just hours ago. His vest was the same, the patches unmistakable, but there was something else now, something composed, something intentional. He walked toward the entrance without hesitation, the others remaining behind him, forming a silent line that stretched across the lot. Inside, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the man stepped in, the faint scent of the outside air following him, cool and clean. The room seemed to shrink slightly, not physically, but in feeling, as every eye turned toward him. He paused just inside, his gaze scanning the space once, then settling on Aaliyah. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the manager, not the customers, not the tension in the air. Just that look, steady, clear, and unmistakably aware. Aaliyah stood still behind the counter, her hands resting lightly against the surface, her posture straight, her expression calm even as her heart beat a little faster. The man took a few steps forward, his boots quiet against the floor, stopping a few feet from her. Up close, she could see the same lines in his face, but they no longer carried the same weight. He looked at her the same way he had the night before, like he was seeing something that mattered. Behind him, through the glass, the row of bikers remained still, waiting, their presence filling the space beyond the walls. Her manager shifted beside her, clearing his throat, trying to reclaim control of a situation that had already moved beyond him. "Can I help you?" he asked, forcing a professional tone that did not quite hold. The man did not look at him. His attention stayed on Aaliyah. Then, after a brief pause, he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying through the room without needing to be loud. "I came back for her." The words landed softly, but they changed everything, settling into the silence like a turning point that could not be undone, while outside, the line of motorcycles stood still under the gray sky, waiting for what would come next. The words lingered in the air, simple and direct, yet heavy enough to shift the entire room around them, and for a moment no one moved. Not the customers near the shelves, not the manager behind the counter, not even Aaliyah, whose breath slowed just slightly as she held his gaze, trying to understand what stood behind those 5 quiet words. "I came back for her." It did not sound like a demand. It did not carry urgency or pressure, just certainty, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The manager straightened a little, his posture stiff, his eyes flicking between Aaliyah and the man as if trying to piece together a situation that no longer followed the rules he understood. "Sir," he began carefully, forcing a polite tone. "If there is an issue, we can handle it professionally." The man finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge him, not dismissive, not aggressive, just measured. "There is no issue," he said calmly. "Not anymore." Then his attention returned to Aaliyah, and with it came that same quiet focus from the night before, the same recognition that seemed to exist outside of everything else. Aaliyah felt it again, that subtle shift in her chest, not fear, not expectation, just awareness, like standing at the edge of something that had already begun to change. She stepped out from behind the counter slowly, her movements unhurried, her posture steady, even as the room seemed to tighten around each step she took. The floor felt solid beneath her feet, the air still carrying that faint mix of coffee and rain-dampened clothing, but everything else felt distant, like the world had narrowed to a single line between her and the man standing in front of her. "You did not have to come back," she said softly, her voice even, not questioning, not assuming, just stating what she believed. The man watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable at first, then something softened, just slightly. "Yes," he replied, "I did." Outside, a faint breeze moved across the lot, stirring the edges of jackets and loose fabric, the line of motorcycles standing silent now, their presence steady, waiting without impatience. Inside, the light shifted as clouds passed overhead, a brief dimming that seemed to pull the moment deeper into itself. Aaliyah glanced toward the door for just a second, taking in the quiet line of riders, the way they stood without speaking, without moving, as if they were part of something larger than the moment itself. Then she looked back at him. "Why?" she asked, the words simple, but carrying everything she did not say. The man exhaled slowly, not as a sigh, but as if releasing something he had been holding on to. His gaze dropped briefly to the counter, then returned to her, steady again. Because last night, he said, choosing his words carefully, you were the only one who saw a person instead of a problem. The sentence settled between them, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Aaliyah felt it land, felt the truth in it, and for a moment she did not respond, her eyes holding his, her expression unchanged but her thoughts moving quietly beneath the surface. Behind her, the manager shifted again, the discomfort in his stance growing, his earlier certainty now replaced with something closer to unease. Look, he said, attempting to regain control, we have policies here. If this is about what happened last night, it has already been addressed. Aaliyah did not turn. She remained where she was, her attention still on the man in front of her, the rest of the room fading once more into the background. The man gave a small nod, acknowledging the words without engaging them, then reached into the inside pocket of his vest, his movements slow, deliberate, as if the action itself mattered. He pulled out a small folded envelope, worn at the edges but carefully kept, holding it for a moment before extending it toward her. He did not push it forward, did not insist, he simply offered it, his hand steady, his expression calm. This is for you, he said. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Aaliyah looked down at the envelope, then back up at him, her eyes searching, not for what it was, but for why. You do not owe me anything, she said quietly, her voice carrying the same steady truth as before. The man's lips pressed together briefly, not in disagreement, but in understanding. I know, he answered. That is why this matters. Outside, the clouds began to part just enough for a thin line of sunlight to break through, catching against the glass and casting a soft reflection across the floor, while inside, the moment stretched, balanced between what had already happened and what was about to be revealed, held together by something neither of them needed to name. For a moment, Aaliyah did not reach for the envelope, her eyes resting on it as if it carried more than just paper, as if it held a weight she needed to understand before accepting. The man did not move his hand, did not rush her, his patience steady, grounded, like he had already decided he would wait as long as it took. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer tense, it was deliberate, like something unfolding exactly the way it was meant to. Aaliyah finally lifted her hand, slow and careful, her fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope before taking it fully, the texture slightly rough beneath her skin, real, present. She did not open it right away. Instead, she looked back up at him, her expression calm but searching. What is this? She asked softly. The man exhaled, his gaze steady, but there was something different in it now, something more open, like he was about to reveal a part of himself he did not often show. It is not just from me, he said. Aaliyah's brow softened slightly, her eyes shifting for just a moment toward the line of riders outside, then back to him. He followed her. Glance, a faint nod acknowledging what she was beginning to realize. Last night, he continued, his voice low, measured, you thought no one was watching. He paused, just enough for the words to settle. But we were. The room seemed to shift again, not physically, but in understanding, as the meaning of his words spread quietly through the space. Aaliyah felt at first, a subtle tightening in her chest, not fear, but realization. We had stopped here before, he said, earlier than you think. Some of us were inside, some outside. We were passing through, nothing more. His eyes returned to hers, steady, honest. Then we saw what happened. Aaliyah's fingers tightened slightly around the envelope, her mind replaying the night before, the quiet judgment in the room, the way everyone had turned away, the way she had stepped forward without knowing who might be watching or what it might mean. You did not ask who I was, he went on. You did not hesitate long enough to calculate what you might lose, and you did not expect anything in return. His voice did not rise, but each word carried weight, grounded in something real. That is not common. Behind him, through the glass, one of the riders shifted slightly, not breaking formation, just adjusting, the small movement somehow reinforcing the stillness of everyone else. Aaliyah looked past him again, really seeing them this time, not as a group to be feared or avoided, but as individuals standing together, present, aware. When she looked back, her expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough to show she understood more now. So this is a reward? She asked quietly. The man shook his head almost immediately. No, he said. It is recognition. The distinction settled between them, simple but important. Aaliyah glanced down at the envelope again, then slowly opened it, her fingers careful, almost hesitant, as if she was unfolding more than just paper. Inside was a check, the number written clearly, unmistakably larger than anything she had ever held in her hands. Her breath caught, not sharply, but enough to break the steady rhythm she had been holding on to. For a moment, the room seemed to fall away, the sounds fading into a distant hum as she tried to process what she was seeing. It was not just enough to cover a bill or two. It was enough to change. Something real. Her mother's medication. Rent. Time. Space to breathe. She looked back up at him, her eyes searching again, but this time not for understanding, for confirmation. "This is too much," she said, her voice quieter now, not rejecting, but overwhelmed by the scale of it. The man held her gaze, steady, unshaken. "It is exactly what it needs to be," he replied. Aaliyah's fingers tightened slightly around the check, the paper trembling just enough to betray what she was feeling beneath her calm exterior. Behind her, the manager stood completely still now, his earlier authority gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief, his eyes fixed on the envelope, on the number he could not yet see but already felt. The room had changed, not just in atmosphere, but in truth. What had been dismissed the night before as a mistake, as something careless, now stood in front of them as something undeniable. Aaliyah lowered her gaze once more, not to hide, but to steady herself, the weight of the moment settling in fully now, pressing gently but firmly against everything she thought she knew about how the world worked. When she looked back up, her posture remained the same, her shoulders straight, her expression composed, but something inside her had shifted, something quiet but permanent, like a line crossed not by force, but by choice, and finally, by being seen. Aaliyah stood there with the envelope still open in her hands, the edges of the paper catching the soft light that now filtered through the front windows, the number on the check no longer just something she saw, but something she felt settling into her reality, heavy and unreal at the same time. For a moment, she said nothing, her fingers steadying the slight tremor that had passed through them, her breathing slow as she grounded herself in the present, in the sound of the quiet store, in the faint hum of electricity, in the distant stillness of the world outside. Then she carefully folded the check back into the envelope, not out of rejection, but out of respect, like it was something that needed to be held with intention, not shock. She looked up at him again, her eyes clear now, no longer searching, but understanding. "This changes a lot," she said softly, her voice steady, not overwhelmed anymore, just honest. The man nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it without taking ownership of it. "It does," he replied, "but it does not change who you are." The words landed differently, not as praise, not as reassurance, but as something deeper, something grounding. Aaliyah held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if accepting not just the envelope, but the meaning behind it. Behind him, one of the riders stepped forward slightly, carrying something rectangular, wrapped simply, not elaborate, not decorative, just solid. He stopped a few feet behind the man and handed it to him without a word, then stepped back into place. The movement was quiet, precise, like everything else they had done. The man turned back to Aaliyah, holding the box now, and extended it toward her in the same calm, deliberate way he had offered the envelope. "There is one more thing," he said. Aaliyah hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then reached out and took it, her hands adjusting to its weight, heavier than she expected, but not unmanageable. She looked down at it briefly, then back up at him, a question in her eyes even before she spoke. "What is it?" she asked. The man gave a faint smile, the first hint of something lighter in his expression. "Open it," he said simply. Aaliyah lowered her gaze again, setting the envelope against her side as she carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a small metal box, and within it, neatly placed, were keys. Not just a single key, but a full set, attached to a simple keychain with a small engraved tag. She picked them up slowly, the soft clink of metal sounding louder than it should in the quiet room. Her brow furrowed slightly as she turned them in her hand, the engraving catching the light just enough for her to read it. An address. Not far. Just a few blocks from where she lived. She looked up again, confusion and realization meeting at the same time. The man watched her carefully, giving her space to understand before speaking. "It is a place," he said, his voice as steady as before. "Clean, safe, paid for as long as you need to get back on your feet." The words settled into her slowly, each one finding its place, each one expanding the meaning of what was happening beyond anything she had expected. Her grip tightened slightly around the keys, the cool metal grounding her in the moment. "You do not even know me," she said, not as a refusal, but as a truth she needed to say out loud. The man nodded again, his expression unchanged. "I know enough," he replied. "I know what you did when no one was watching. That tells me more than anything else." The room remained silent, but it was no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. It was full, complete in a way that did not need more words. Behind the counter, the manager shifted again, his earlier stance completely gone now, replaced by something quieter, something closer to reflection, though he said nothing. Aaliyah looked down at the keys once more, then back at the man, her posture still straight, her presence still calm, but her eyes softer now, carrying something new, something that had not been there before. Not relief, not disbelief, something steadier, something earned. She closed her fingers around the keys, the small sound of metal pressing together marking the moment in a way no one could miss. And for the first time since the morning began, she allowed herself a small, quiet breath that reached deeper than the rest, as if something inside her had finally found space to expand. The moment did not end with applause or raised voices or anything that demanded attention. It unfolded quietly, the way something real often does, as Aaliyah stood there with the keys in her hand and the envelope held close to her side, the weight of both settling into her not as something overwhelming, but as something grounding, something that belonged to the same choice she had made the night before. She looked at the man one more time, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and gave a small nod that carried more than words could, not just gratitude, but understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud. He returned the nod, just as simple, just as clear, then stepped back, not lingering, not waiting for anything more, because there was nothing left to prove. Behind him, the line of riders shifted almost as one, not in urgency, but in completion, like a chapter closing without needing to announce it. The door opened again with that same soft hiss, letting in the cool air and the faint sound of the outside world. Returning to its normal rhythm, and one by one, they stepped out, moving back toward their motorcycles with the same quiet discipline they had arrived with. Aaliyah watched them through the glass, her reflection faintly overlapping theirs, her figure still and centered while the world moved around her. The engine started again, not loud, not aggressive, just present, a low steady hum that filled the space for a moment before easing back, each bike pulling away in sequence, the line dissolving not into chaos, but into distance, until the lot was empty again, the pavement still damp, the sky beginning to open into a softer shade of morning. Inside, the silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was lighter now, clearer, like something had been removed that no one had noticed until it was gone. Aaliyah remained where she was for a moment longer, her fingers still wrapped around the keys, the metal cool against her skin, real, undeniable. She turned slightly, her gaze moving across the small store, the shelves, the counter, the place that had defined her routine for so long, and then to her manager, who stood quietly now, his posture no longer rigid, his expression no longer certain. For a brief second, their eyes met, and in that space there was no argument, no justification, just a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of them had fully understood before. Aaliyah did not speak. She did not need to. She stepped around the counter slowly, placing the envelope carefully into her bag, her movements calm, deliberate, then walked toward the door, each step measured, steady, the sound of her shoes against the floor soft but certain. The bell chimed again as she pushed the door open, the morning air meeting her with a gentle breeze, carrying the faint scent of rain and something new, something clean. She paused just outside, not to hesitate, but to feel it, the shift, the space in front of her that had not been there before. In her hand, the keys rested with quiet weight, and for a moment she lifted them slightly, the small glint of metal catching the light as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a soft warmth across the lot. There was no rush in her movement, no sudden change in who she was, just a continuation, a quiet step forward into something earned, not given. She walked down the sidewalk, away from the station, her figure steady against the growing light, her shadow stretching slightly behind her, then beside her as the angle shifted. And in that stillness, in that simple motion, there was something that did not need to be said, something that lived in the space between what had been lost and what had been returned, something that could only be felt, like the quiet presence of justice finally settling into place, not loud, not demanding, just there, undeniable, carried forward in every step she took into the morning.